She didn't scream. That was the first thing Kang Hejun noticed. Most people screamed, or begged, or, at the very minimum, flinched. But the woman standing in the middle of his restaurant, his closed restaurant, where no civilian was supposed to be, where three of his most feared lieutenants had just cornered her against the bar, didn't do any of those things. She set down her glass of water, slowly, deliberately, like she had all the time in the world. And then she looked at the largest of the three men, Baek Min-jae, 230 pounds of enforcer who had once broken a gambling debt collector's wrist just to make a point. And she said, very quietly, "I'm going to need you to move." Hejun had been watching from the mezzanine level, half hidden behind the frosted glass partition that separated the private dining area from the floor below. He'd come down early, before the staff arrived, before the city of Seoul had fully shaken itself awake, because he couldn't sleep, a condition that had plagued him for 11 months now. Ever since the CO family dissolution left a power vacuum the size of a crater in the underground economy of Gangnam. He hadn't expected to find anyone in the restaurant. He certainly hadn't expected her. The woman, mid-20s, dark hair pulled back with the kind of effortless severity that suggested she either didn't care or cared enormously, was dressed in the uniform of a municipal building inspector. Beige jacket, laminated badge clipped to her lapel, clipboard tucked under one arm. She had apparently entered through the service entrance, which meant she either had keys she shouldn't have or she'd picked the lock, which was a Schley Grade 1 deadbolt that Hejun had specifically chosen because his security consultant had called it virtually unpickable by anyone without professional training. His three men had found her photographing the ventilation system. Min-jae had not handled the discovery gently. "You're trespassing," Min-jae said now, his voice carrying the particular low rumble of someone who enjoyed the sound of their own threats. "This is private property, and you're holding a camera you shouldn't have." "It's a phone," the woman said. "What? You said camera. It's a phone." Semantics matter in administrative documentation. There was a beat of stunned silence. Then Min-jae reached out and grabbed her wrist. The next 4 seconds happened so fast that Hejun, who had witnessed things in his life that had recalibrated his entire understanding of human capability, actually leaned forward over the partition railing, grip tightening on the frosted glass. She didn't pull away. She stepped in, toward Min-jae, not away, closing the distance instead of retreating, which broke the mechanical logic of his grip entirely, because the leverage a restraining hold requires depends on the person pulling back. When she moved forward, his wrist lock became structurally useless. She rotated her arm in a single, fluid motion, the kind of motion that looks from the outside, almost casual, almost accidental. And suddenly it was his wrist that was angled wrong, pressure building against the joint in a way that made him inhale sharply through his teeth. She still hadn't raised her voice. "I said I need you to move," she repeated. "I have a scheduled inspection window that closes in 40 minutes, and the ventilation compliance report is due to the district office by noon. So either you let me finish, or I flag this property for a full structural audit, which will bring approximately 11 additional city officials through this building over the next 2 weeks." She tilted her head, almost pleasantly. "Your choice." Min-jae stared at her. She released his wrist and stepped back, smoothing her jacket. And Hejun, Kang Hejun, who had not been surprised by a human being in longer than he could accurately remember, felt something shift in the back of his chest. Not warmth exactly, not admiration exactly, something more like recognition. The way you recognize a chess player in the middle of a crowded room, not because they're holding a board, but because of how they scan exits. He descended the mezzanine stairs. "Leave us." His voice wasn't loud. It never needed to be. The three men cleared the restaurant floor in under 15 seconds, Min-jae casting one backward glance that landed somewhere between wounded pride and genuine unease. The woman watched them go. Then she turned and looked at Hejun, and he expected wariness, because everyone who encountered him for the first time in an uncontrolled environment defaulted to wariness. It was essentially biological, but instead she just looked assessing, like she was reading a floor plan, taking measurements. "You're the owner," she said. It wasn't a question. Kang Hejun, Yun Seoyan. She didn't offer her hand. "Building inspector, Gangnam District Regulatory Office." "I know who you are," he said. Something flickered across her face then. So brief, it was almost subliminal. Then you know I'm here officially. I know your badge number is registered to an office that was restructured 4 months ago, he said. I know the inspection schedule for this district doesn't include this property until the third quarter. And I know that the Gangnam District Regulatory Office doesn't typically send inspectors alone before business hours, with a lockpicking set tucked into the inner pocket of a beige jacket. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Seoyin looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the composure of someone who had prepared for this exact moment and had simply been waiting to see how long it took to arrive, she said, "We need to talk about what's inside your walls. If this story already has you gripping your screen, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. The people who stay until the end are the ones who see the twist coming and still don't see it coming. Subscribe, because this kind of storytelling doesn't repeat itself." Hajun did not rattle easily. This was a fact that his enemies had tested over the years with increasingly creative methodologies: financial destabilization, personal threats, the occasional attempt at leverage through people he cared about, which had dwindled to a very small list after he'd spent his 30s systematically removing vulnerability from his life like a surgeon excising tissue. He sat across from Yoon Soyeon in the private dining room, the city of Seoul beginning its morning noise outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the distant percussion of delivery trucks, the low harmonic of the subway 2 blocks east, the particular quality of early light that turns every building in Gangnam into something that looks almost innocent. She had placed her phone on the table between them, face down, a gesture that said, "I'm not recording this." He noted that she hadn't turned it off, which said something else entirely. Something like, "I don't need to." 6 weeks ago, she began, a woman named Park Yoonji filed a noise complaint against this property. Routine. The kind of complaint that gets logged and ignored 98% of the time. She paused. "Yoonji is my cousin." Hajun said nothing. 3 days after filing the complaint, she stopped returning calls. A week after that, she submitted a formal withdrawal, handwritten, which she never does. She's meticulous about digital records, and relocated to Busan. Seoyin's voice remained even, but something beneath it had a tinsel quality, like wire under stress. "I spoke to her once, briefly, before she left. She told me to drop it. She told me the complaint was a mistake and that she'd overreacted." A beat. She was crying while she said it. "That sounds like a family matter," Hajun said. Her noise complaint described vibrations, Seoyin said. Consistent, rhythmic, low frequency. She thought it was industrial equipment. She even included approximate timestamps: 2 a.m. to 5 a.m., 3 to 4 nights per week. She met his eyes directly. "This restaurant doesn't operate between 2 and 5 a.m., Mr. Kong." The morning light moved across the table between them. Hajun had built his entire professional architecture on reading people, on the micro variations of behavior that separated honest confusion from strategic positioning, genuine fear from performed emotion. The woman across from him was afraid. He could see it in the controlled quality of her stillness, the way she'd chosen a seat that kept the door in her peripheral vision. But her fear was not of him specifically. It was older than this room, more generalized. The kind of fear that settles into a person after they've already lost something and are trying not to lose more. That was interesting. "What do you think is in my walls?" he asked. "I think something is moving through your walls," she said. "The ventilation infrastructure in this building is 18% larger than the filed architectural plans indicate. The discrepancy isn't visible from the exterior, but the intake measurements don't match the output measurements, and the differential is consistent with." She hesitated for the first time. "With a secondary passage system." Hajun looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away. "You came here alone," he said. "Without backup, without authorization, without telling anyone where you were. That's either very brave or very reckless. Those aren't mutually exclusive." "No," he agreed quietly. "They're not." What he didn't tell her, what he couldn't tell her, not yet, not in a room where every variable was still uncontrolled, was that he already knew about the passage system. He had known for 9 weeks. He had discovered it by accident, during a private renovation he'd commissioned to expand the wine cellar in the sub-basement, a project he'd kept off the official contractor records because the sub-basement itself existed in a regulatory gray area that predated his ownership by 3 decades. The construction crew had broken through what they'd assumed was a reinforced concrete partition and found instead a crawlspace corridor, roughly a meter wide, that extended northward beneath the building's foundation and connected, as best he could determine from the structural maps he'd quietly obtained, to the utility infrastructure running beneath Tehran RO. He'd sealed it immediately, dismissed the construction crew with generous and firmly worded compensation, had the breakthrough point rebuilt with materials that were, this time, actually solid concrete. And then he'd spent 9 weeks trying to determine who had built it and what it had been used for. Because the passage wasn't empty when they found it. There were marks on the walls. Not graffiti, not maintenance notations. Small, systematic, incremental, the kind of marks that people make when they're counting, when they're tracking time passing in the absence of any other reference point. Hejun had photographed every centimeter of those walls before sealing them, and he had not, in 9 weeks, been able to make himself stop thinking about them. The restaurant's morning prep staff would begin arriving in 45 minutes. Hejun had that long to make a decision about Yin Seoyin, about what she knew, what she was likely to do with it, and what, if anything, the right course of action looked like in a situation that had no precedent in his experience. He slid the phone she'd placed between them back across the table toward her. "Your inspection," he said. "Finish it." She blinked. "You're letting me complete your documentation of the ventilation system. Take whatever measurements you came for." He stood. "I'll have someone show you the sub-basement." "The sub-basement isn't on the filed plans." "No," he said. "It isn't." She stared at him for a moment. Recalibrating, he could see it happening in real time, the rapid reassessment of a scenario that had not gone the direction she'd anticipated. She had come prepared for resistance, for intimidation or denial, or the particular brand of institutional pressure that powerful men in this city use the way other people use weather, as a background condition that simply existed and shaped everything around it. She had not prepared for cooperation. Why, she asked. It was the right question. He'd been expecting a wrong one. Because whatever was in that passage, he said, "I want to know too." He assigned Cha Dong-hyun to escort her, his youngest lieutenant, and the only one among his inner circle who possessed what Hejun privately thought of as subtlety of attention. Min-jae noticed everything but processed it loudly. Dong-hyun noticed everything and said almost nothing, which made him simultaneously excellent at surveillance and unexpectedly disarming in civilian interactions. People tended to relax around him in ways they regretted later. Seoyin did not relax, but she was professional in a way that was itself a kind of armor, and watching her work. The precision of her measurements, the quiet efficiency of her documentation, the way she photographed each section of the sub-basement's eastern wall with the systematic patience of someone who understood that details matter more than conclusions. Hejun found himself revising his initial assessment of her. She wasn't a building inspector, or rather, she was technically, demonstrably, with credentials that would hold up to a surface-level verification. But the way she moved through a space was not the way of someone trained to find code violations and structural deviations. It was the way of someone trained to find evidence. The question was, evidence for whom? It was Dong-hyun who found the second thing. He'd been standing near the sealed partition, the freshly poured concrete that now covered what had been the passage entrance, when he crouched down and pressed 2 fingers to the floor. He looked up at Hejun without expression. There was a small depression in the concrete floor, roughly circular, approximately 3 centimeters across. It hadn't been there when Hejun had last personally inspected this level. Someone had been drilling. Someone had been trying to reopen the passage from the outside. And they had been here recently enough that the concrete dust was still faintly present in the depression, not yet dispersed by the ventilation system. Seoyin crouched beside Dong-hyun and looked at the depression in silence for a moment. Then she looked up at Hejun, and for the first time since he'd met her, her composure showed a hairline fracture. Something in her eyes that was not quite fear and not quite certainty, but lived in the narrow territory between them. "They're still looking," she said. Yes, Hejun said, which means whatever they were using this for. She paused. It isn't finished. The morning outside had fully arrived now, Seoul filling itself with purpose and momentum. Thousands of people moving through thousands of interconnected routines. The city's surface life going on precisely as it always did. Orderly, determined, achingly ordinary. Down in the sub-basement, none of that seemed real. 3 days passed. Hejun did not contact Yin Seoyin, and Seoyin did not contact him. He found this interval significant. Not because silence implied disengagement, but because of what her silence cost. A woman investigating something personal and potentially dangerous, who had walked alone into a Korean organized crime establishment at 6 in the morning and come away with evidence of an unexplained underground passage and fresh drilling activity, had every reason to move quickly, to escalate, to bring whatever she found to whoever she was actually working for. That she hadn't meant she was thinking, and that she was thinking meant she hadn't anticipated everything she found. On the fourth morning, she appeared at his private office. Not the restaurant, but the consultancy firm on the 14th floor of a building in Seoul that served as the legitimate financial architecture above everything else he operated. She had obtained the address through means he didn't immediately trace, which itself told him something. And she brought this time a folder. She sat down across from his desk without being invited. Park Yunji isn't in Busan, she said. He waited. She was for about 11 days. Seoyin placed the folder on the desk, but didn't open it. Then she came back, not to her apartment, not to any address connected to her name. But I found a credit card transaction in Mabu, a pharmacy, for days ago. She looked at him steadily. She bought bandages, antiseptic, a week's worth of over-the-counter antibiotics. Something in the room went very still. She's hurt, Hejun said. She's hiding. Seoyin's voice was level, but her hands, resting on the closed folder, were pressing slightly harder than the situation required. Until she probably didn't know she had. She's hiding and she's hurt, and she went through a significant amount of effort to disappear from everyone who knows her, including me. Which means she either doesn't trust me to help her, or she's protecting me from something she knows about. A pause, or both. What's in the folder? She opened it. The contents were architectural, not building plans. These were older, pre-digital, the kind of drafting table originals that predated standardization of municipal filing systems. They showed the sub-basement of his restaurant not as it existed now, but as it had been designed. In 1987, when the building was originally constructed as a commercial warehouse for a textile import business. And in those original plans, the passage was not a secret. It was labeled Emergency Egress Corridor. Connect to Municipal Utility Access. Approved Variance File 1987. Jan 44991. Legitimate, Hejun said, scanning the notation. Legitimate in 1987, Seoyin confirmed. But Variance 1987, Jan 4491 was officially closed, and the corridor was supposed to be decommissioned in 1999 when the building changed ownership. She pointed to a second document in the folder, a decommissioning certificate signed and stamped. Except the physical decommissioning never happened. Someone forged the sign-off. Hejun looked at the signature on the decommissioning certificate. Then he looked at it again, because the name on it, the inspector's name, the official who had supposedly certified the corridor's closure in 1999, was a name he recognized. Not from the building's history. From a conversation he'd had 6 weeks ago in a private room at a members club in Itaewon with a man named Shin Jae-ho who had proposed a business arrangement that Hejun had declined. Shin Jae-ho, who was, among other things, the current deputy director of Gangnam's Municipal Infrastructure Division. The man who would have access to every file plan, every variance record, every decommissioning certificate in the district. The man who Hejun now understood with the particular cold clarity of a pattern completing itself, had likely known about that passage for decades. Who had perhaps been the one to ensure it was never truly closed. Who had used the legitimate machinery of municipal administration as a mechanism for something else entirely. something that had left counting marks on underground walls and driven a frightened woman to flee to Busan with a handwritten note recanting a noise complaint. He closed the folder. How much of this have you shared, he asked. With you? Everything. Seoyin's eyes held his. With anyone else? Nothing. Why? The question hung between them the way important questions do. Not as a challenge, but as a genuine inquiry, an open hand. And he watched her consider it with the full weight of someone who had been carrying the answer for longer than the conversation had existed. Because the people I would normally bring this to, she said slowly, work in buildings where Shin Jae-ho has signed documents. She exhaled a small controlled sound. And because my cousin is hiding somewhere in Mapo-gu, hurt and afraid, and if I escalate this through the wrong channel, she stops being a frightened person and starts being a liability that someone needs to manage. The word manage, in that context, did not mean paperwork. Hajun understood what she was asking. Not directly. She was too intelligent and too careful for a direct ask, and she had, he suspected, a deep and principled aversion to the kind of arrangement she was implicitly proposing. But the architecture of the moment was inescapable. She had come to him with everything she had. She had brought it here, to his office, to him specifically, not to law enforcement, not to a journalist, not to a colleague she trusted. To the man whose building contained the sealed passage. To the man who had, 3 days ago, looked at fresh drilling marks on a concrete floor and said they're not finished with an inflection that suggested he intended to have a perspective on that. I need to find her before they do, Seoyin said. That's it. That's all I need. He found Park Yoonji in 47 hours. She was staying in a semi-basement unit in Mangwon-dong, the kind of apartment that exists in the negative spaces of Seoul's real estate geography, accessible by a staircase that descends from a side alley, the kind of address that doesn't appear on most navigation applications. She'd paid 3 months in advance, in cash, to a landlord who asked no questions because the rent was above market rate, and the tenant seemed quiet. She was quiet. She was also 23 years old, and she had been living alone in a 90-square-foot room for 11 days with injuries that had been treated only partially and incorrectly, and when Dong-hyun opened the door, she'd left it unlocked, which itself was a kind of surrender, a sign that the alertness required to maintain precaution had simply run out. She looked at him with the specific blankness of someone whose fear has metabolized into something that no longer has a name. Hajun stood in the doorway behind Dong-hyun, and what he saw in that room, the careful small order she'd made of it, the medications lined up by the narrow window, the phone turned off and battery removed beside it, the single photograph she'd propped against the wall, which showed her and Seoyin perhaps 5 or 6 years ago, laughing at something outside the frame, recalibrated something in him that had not been touched in a long time. He did not go inside. He made one call, to a physician he trusted with the particular specificity of someone who understood confidentiality as a structural rather than ethical principle. And one call after that, to Seoyin. He said 4 words, I found her. Kulme. The reunion between the two women was not something he watched. He and Dong-hyun waited in the alley above, in the precise quality of Seoul's late afternoon light, the city's ambient sound moving around them like a current. Delivery robots navigating the narrow streets. The smell of street food from 2 blocks over. A child somewhere laughing. That specific unguarded laugh of someone who has not yet learned to modulate it. Dong-hyun said nothing, which was appropriate. Hajun thought about the counting marks on the walls of a sealed passage, about a forged signature on a 1999 decommissioning certificate, about a deputy director of municipal infrastructure who had proposed a business arrangement 6 weeks ago, an arrangement that, in retrospect, had been structured with unusual specificity around the sub-basement of this particular building, which Hajun had declined without fully understanding why the offer had been made in those exact terms. He understood now. Shin Jae-ho hadn't been offering a business arrangement. He'd been offering a warning dressed as an opportunity, a chance for Hajun to become complicit, to inherit a situation rather than challenge it, to fold the passage and whatever it represented into his own operation so that the accountability became distributed, deniable, shared. It was elegant, in the way that morally catastrophic things sometimes are. And Hajun's refusal, casual, brief, entirely unaware of its actual significance, had apparently been interpreted as something more knowing than it was, which meant Shin Jae-ho believed, currently, that Kang Ha-jun was a threat, which meant the drilling in the sub-basement floor was not random. It was targeted, and it would happen again. Seo-yin emerged from the staircase 40 minutes later. She looked different from every version of herself he'd seen in the past 4 days. Not softer, exactly, but less armored. As if the particular vigilance she maintained had, for the last 40 minutes, been allowed to rest. She stopped a few feet from him on the alley stones. She told me what she heard, Seo-yin said. The night she filed the complaint. She'd been walking home at 3 a.m. She works late. She's a nurse. And she heard something through the ventilation grate in the building's exterior wall. She described it as a pause, as someone asking for help. The alley felt very narrow suddenly. She reported it as a noise complaint because she didn't know what else to do, Seo-yin continued. She didn't know what building it was. She didn't know who owned it. She just knew that the sound came from below street level, and it scared her. Her voice remained steady, but the steadiness had the quality of a held breath. 3 days later, 2 men visited her at her apartment. They told her that she'd misheard, that it was building equipment, that filing the complaint had been a misunderstanding, and withdrawing it would be the sensible resolution. A beat. They stayed for 2 hours. She doesn't remember everything they said. She remembers being very, very certain that they were monitoring her. She looked at Ha-jun directly. Someone was in that passage, she said, not operating it, confined in it. The last light of the afternoon moved across the alley in a long, level angle. Ha-jun had known, somewhere beneath the part of himself that preferred actionable information over troubling uncertainty, that this was where the marks on the walls pointed. Had known it, and had spent 9 weeks not quite saying it to himself in those terms, because saying it in those terms meant a specific and irrevocable set of consequences. Yes, he said, and Shin Jae-ho. I'll handle Shin Jae-ho. That's not, she stopped. Reorganized. I need this to go through a process that creates accountability, that doesn't disappear into the same private arrangements that built the problem. I know. Do you? There was no accusation in it. It was a real question, the kind of question that deserves a real answer. He thought about the marks on the walls, the counting marks, the particular human desperation of marking time in the dark. There's a prosecutor in the Central District Office, he said. Im Zo-yeon. She spent 4 years building a case against infrastructure corruption in the Gangnam corridor, and she's done it without being absorbed by any of the systems she's investigating. He watched Seo-yin's expression. She's legitimate, and she's been looking for a thread she can pull without it fraying back into nothing. Seo-yin was quiet for a moment. You give her everything? She asked. Including whatever's in your own records that connects you to that building's history? Yes. The word landed between them with a kind of irreversibility. Why? She asked, the same question, the same directness that she'd used the first morning. The question she reserved for the moments that mattered. Ha-jun thought about how to answer that honestly, not strategically, not in the way he typically assembled statements for external consumption, but actually honestly, which was a mode of speech he'd largely decommissioned over a decade ago for practical reasons. Because I looked at those walls, he said, and I understood what they meant. And that understanding is not something I can unknow and continue to be whatever it is I've been. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms after something true has been said, a structural silence, load-bearing. Then Seo-yin looked away, up at the narrow strip of Seoul sky visible between the alley's walls. That deep, specific blue of early evening, the city's transition hour, when everything is still possible and nothing has yet been decided. She's agreed to talk, Seo-yin said. Yinji, once she's been seen by a physician and she feels safe. A pause. She says there's more than one name. She heard them talking, the 2 men who came to her apartment. She caught part of a conversation they didn't realize she could hear. She hesitated. She says one of the names was someone inside the prosecution service. The courtyard went quiet in the specific way of something about to change. Ha-jun said nothing. Somewhere in a 90-square-foot room below them, a 23-year-old nurse who had made the mistake of walking home at 3 a.m. and hearing something she couldn't unhear, was drinking a cup of tea that Dong Hyun had found the means to procure from a convenience store on the corner. Somewhere in the city, Shin Jae-ho was moving through his evening unaware that the forged signature on a 1999 document was currently in a folder in the inner pocket of Seo-yeon's jacket. Somewhere in the Central District office, Im Soo-hyun was working late on a case that was about to become something much larger than she knew. And in an alley in Mangwon-dong, the man that half of Seoul's underworld called upon and feared was standing next to a woman who had walked into his restaurant before dawn, set down a glass of water, and told a 230-pound enforcer to move, and was now the only person he'd told the truth to in longer than he could accurately say. "If there's a name inside the prosecution service," Hajun said quietly, "then Im Soo-hyun is the only person we bring this to. Directly, with everything documented and duplicated before we hand it over." He looked at Seo-yeon, "Which means you and your cousin are not safe in any location connected to your existing identity until this moves." Seo-yeon absorbed this. "You're talking about disappearing us. I'm talking about protecting you while the thing you've built holds." He paused. "There's a difference." She turned and looked at him then, really looked, the way she'd looked at the ventilation measurements, the sub-basement walls, the drilling depression in the concrete, with the full, unguarded precision of her attention, taking actual measurements. "After this," she said carefully, "after the documentation reaches Im Soo-hyun and the process starts, what do you do?" He considered the question. "I don't know yet," he said. And then, because the honesty of the moment seemed to require its full extension, "That's the first true thing I've said about myself in 11 months. The evening came down around them, Seoul finding its nighttime frequency, the shift in sound and light and purpose that the city makes each day without ceremony, without announcement. Below them, a door opened and closed. Above them, the first suggestion of stars appeared in the diminishing blue. She didn't answer him, but she also didn't leave. And in the weight of that, in the specific gravity of a woman who had no reason to trust him and every reason to keep moving, choosing instead to stand in a Mangwon-dong alley while the city turned to night around them, Kang Hae-jun felt something he hadn't felt in the 11 months since the world he'd built started showing its fault lines. He felt the future as a direction, not just a continuation. From somewhere deep beneath the city, beneath the restaurants and the offices and the file plans and the forged signatures and the sealed passages and all the careful architecture of what people build to hide what they've done, something was still waiting to be found. And for the first time, he thought maybe it should be. The counting marks were still there, sealed behind concrete in the dark. And somewhere in that city, the person who made them was either still counting or had finally stopped. What would you do if you discovered that something was buried beneath the ordinary world you'd always trusted, and the only person who could help you was the last person you expected?